And now, please welcome Dr. Shannon Elizabeth Bell, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia Tech. Her research falls at the intersection of environmental sociology, gender, and social movements, with a particular focus on understanding the ways in which environmentally destructive industries acquire, maintain, and exercise their power, and discovering strategies for increasing the political participation of communities most affected by environmental injustices. She is the author of the award-winning book, Fighting King Coal: The Challenges to Micromobilization in Central Appalachia.
Thank you so much to the Actors Circle Ensemble and Casey Adler for inviting me to be part of this program. Those 3 plays were amazing. It's really a huge honor to be part of this. So I have some slides that I'm going to attempt to share now to accompany my talk. Okay, so this evening, I'm going to be speaking about environmental justice, some of the history of environmental justice struggles in the United States, and then I'm also going to speak a little bit about my own research on coal-related environmental injustices in Central Appalachia. There are certain areas of the United States and the world treated as sacrifice zones, places where the resources and the people living there are exploited in the name of progress or national security. In these sacrifice zones, the true costs of energy production and consumer products are externalized onto local people and their environment in the form of pollution, destruction of the land, and limited economic opportunities. Sacrifice zones are part of a larger pattern of environmental inequality that exists around the world. Environmental justice scholars have found that not all people share the burden of environmental hazards and pollution equally. Rather, those with the least political and economic power bear a disproportionate share of the waste and pollution created by society. These groups most often include communities of color, low-income communities, indigenous groups, and people living in global South nations. However, over the past 3 decades, sacrifice zone communities have fought back in increasing numbers. Grassroots movements resisting the environmental injustices of corporate and military pollution have sprung up across the world, from the African American communities fighting pollution in Louisiana's chemical corridor to the indigenous peoples fighting against nuclear colonialism on Aboriginal land in Australia.
Hi, Dr. Bell, we can't see your slides. Just wanted to let you know.
Oh my goodness.
Okay. I am the voice of Actors Circle Ensemble, everyone. Casey
Thank
Adler.
you. All right, thank you. I think I must have forgotten to hit share slide or share screen. Hang on.
I'll be joining for the Q&A. Please stay tuned.
I think there's, thank you for interrupting me.
Not a problem.
Okay. All right, maybe this one will work.
Fantastic.
Okay, hang on 1 second. Okay, there, can we see now? We good?
Yeah, that's
okay,
perfect.
Awesome, sorry everyone. Okay, so I'll pick up where I was. So over the past 3 decades, sacrifice zone communities have been fighting back in increasing numbers. Grassroots movements resisting the environmental injustices of corporate and military pollution have sprung up across the world, from African American communities fighting pollution in Louisiana's chemical corridor to indigenous peoples fighting against nuclear colonialism on Aboriginal land in Australia. These movements, which are collectively referred to as environmental justice movements, are distinct from mainstream environmentalism in their focus on social justice for people who live, work, play, and learn in the most polluted environments in the world. Thus, rather than focus on conservation efforts only, environmental justice movements aim to protect the health and safety of socially vulnerable individuals and their communities. So before discussing the environmental injustices taking place in the coal fields of Central Appalachia, which is currently a predominantly white working class population, I want to first speak a little bit about the history of the environmental justice movement in the United States, which emerged out of the civil rights movement in recognition of the environmental racism that African American communities experienced and are still experiencing today. So Warren County, North Carolina has been called the birthplace of the environmental justice movement in the United States. In the early 1980s, protests were ignited over the siting and subsequent dumping of toxic PCB-laden soil in a landfill in this community. The soil came from 210 miles of roadways in 14 counties in North Carolina, which had been contaminated with PCB-laden transformer oil from a trucking company that was hired to dispose of the contaminated oil. Instead of disposing of the oil legally, the owners instead chose to dribble the 30,000 gallons of toxic oil along 210 miles of highways in North Carolina. When the contamination was discovered, rather than neutralize the 40,000 cubic yards of contaminated soil by incinerating it, the state decided to go the cheaper route and have it dumped in a landfill in Warren County, which is the county with the highest percentage of African Americans in the state. As one resident told a newspaper reporter from the Washington Post, "We know why they picked us. It's because it's a poor county, poor politically, poor in health, poor in education, and because it's mostly Black. Nobody thought that people like us would make a fuss." However, the local residents did make a fuss, and they organized a tremendous grassroots resistance effort against the landfill. These protests ignited a movement for environmental justice, helping spark a Government Accountability Office investigation into the siting of hazardous waste dumps in Black and low-income communities in the southeastern United States. This report and the many studies that have been conducted since have demonstrated again and again and again that people of color and low-income communities across the country and the world are disproportionately burdened with pollution and environmental health harms. Thus, racial justice is an environmental issue. Much of my own focus as a scholar has been on the environmental injustices associated with coal extraction in Central Appalachia, another area that many scholars argue has been treated as a sacrifice zone for more than a century because of its vast coal reserves. Central Appalachia, which includes West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, East Tennessee, and Southwest Virginia, is one of the poorest areas in the nation. More than 75% of Appalachian coal communities are classified as economically distressed by the Appalachian Regional Commission. More than 1 million acres of land and over 500 mountains have been destroyed by mountaintop removal coal mining here. In this method of coal extraction, mountains are blown apart to expose thin seams of coal. This coal is then scraped from the exposure with massive drag lines. The demolished earth that was above the coal, including rock, soil, and trees, is pushed into nearby valleys, creating valley fills, which bury streams and damage fragile ecosystems. One such extraction community is Prenter in Boone County, West Virginia. In 2008, residents discovered that coal waste had been leaching out of an underground coal slurry impoundment into the community's water table for an unknown number of years, contaminating the well water of everyone living there. This coal waste, which is also called slurry or sludge, is generated in the process of cleaning coal and is made up of water, chemicals, and a host of heavy metals and semi-metal compounds that can be toxic when ingested or inhaled. In addition to water contamination, residents living in coal mining communities of Central Appalachia suffer severe and repeated flood events, respiratory problems from coal dust in the air, and structural damage and projectile hazards from blasting, sometimes leading to death. As a result, residents have experienced higher rates of birth defects, cancer, cardiovascular conditions, depression, respiratory illnesses, and mortality than non-coal mining areas, even after controlling for such variables as income and education. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the increasing frequency of coal mining related flooding, sickness, and water contamination led to the emergence of a working class, women-driven environmental justice movement in Central Appalachia, which is the subject of my first book, Our Roots Run Deep as Iron Weed. However, despite the presence of this long-standing environmental justice movement, and despite the enormous health, safety, and environmental costs of coal extraction in this region, there's still widespread support for and defense of the coal industry, both politically and also among many local residents. Fighting King Coal explores this seeming paradox. Why, in the face of tremendous environmental injustice, do so many people choose not to fight back in these coal communities? The commonly cited answer to this question is that people are dependent on coal mining jobs. Now, while this may be a contributing factor, it's certainly not the entire story, as coal mining jobs have declined drastically over the past 60 years. For instance, looking at the state of West Virginia, which is the top coal producing state in Appalachia, coal employment, which is the bottom line on this figure, has steadily declined since the 1940s, while coal production, which is the top line on this figure, continued to increase for much of this time. The decline in mining jobs has primarily been due to technological advances in coal mining, and most recently to the rise in natural gas extraction due to the contentious practice of fracking. So again, particularly in the absence of jobs, why aren't more people taking to the streets and demanding that the coal industry stop destroying their mountains, stop flooding their homes, and stop poisoning their water? The answer to this question lies at the confluence of key historical events, enduring stereotypes, well-funded coal industry propaganda, and some unfortunate missteps by well-meaning activists from outside the region. And while I don't have time to talk about all of these, because I only have about 3 minutes left to talk, I will briefly touch on some of the key historical events and stereotypes that have constrained people's willingness to speak out against coal-related injustices. So one key piece of history that strongly influences decision-making among local residents is the disruption of social networks resulting from the widespread outmigration that began in the 1950s and 1960s and has continued to today. This ongoing process of depopulation has been due to technological advances in coal production over the past 60 years, such as the introduction of the longwall mining machine, the continuous mining machine, and mountaintop removal mining. These technologies have meant that only a fraction of the workers are necessary to mine the same amount of coal. Another key historical fact that has exacerbated these depopulation processes is the high rate of absentee land ownership in Central Appalachia, which has left little opportunity for other industries to develop in the region. In the late 1800s, eager entrepreneurs from outside Appalachia poured into the mountains, procuring millions of acres of land and mineral rights at exceptionally low prices. Local residents, most of whom had been subsistence farmers up until that point, had no idea of the value of the minerals beneath their land. In the early 1980s, when a major study on land ownership in Appalachia was released, nearly 90% of the land in many coal mining counties were still owned by absentee landowners. This land ownership concentration has meant that huge swaths of Appalachia did become unavailable for development outside of resource extraction. One of the many consequences of the mono-economy that was created from this concentration of land was that each wave of layoffs in the mines that followed the introduction of more efficient mining technology meant that large portions of the working age population were forced to migrate out of Appalachia to find employment. Since 1950, West Virginia alone has seen a net outmigration of nearly 40% of its population. And another really important piece of this puzzle is the enduring legacy of the hillbilly stereotype. In innumerable pop culture representations, from films to television shows to children's books to comic strips, Appalachia has, for more than 100 years, been portrayed as a monolithically white, barbaric, isolated frontier filled with uneducated, backward, and violent hillbillies whose impoverishment is a result of their deficient culture. These representations were intentionally created by people from outside the region to justify its exploitation. Herbert Reed and Betsy Taylor, among others, have argued that the social construction of Appalachia as pre-modern or savage has allowed it to serve as a sacrificial scapegoat for the atrocities of capitalism, normalizing devastating practices like mountaintop removal coal mining. But as sociologist Rebecca Scott argues, these stereotypes have also left many Appalachians in a position of feeling the need to prove their worth as American citizens. And essentially, the only thing that they've been told by the rest of the nation that's of value in their mountains is their coal. Thus, supporting the coal industry is viewed by many as being essential for earning the respect of their fellow Americans. And the coal industry has capitalized on this. Now, these historical events and processes, among others that I didn't have a chance to talk about, have influenced in very powerful ways the priorities, concerns, and decisions that local people make on a day-to-day basis. And certainly, they have influenced individuals' willingness to speak out or not speak out against the coal industry. The depopulation and social capital losses have meant that community relationships and connections that are still there are precious. And disrupting those by pissing off your coal truck driving neighbor, for instance, could be a really hard thing to do. The lack of alternative industries has meant that not only are people dependent on each other to help make ends meet, but they're also dependent on coal companies, even if they don't work for the industry at all, to provide donations for community improvement projects or to sponsor the Little League team, or to build a playground at the school. I can't tell you how many times I've had community members tell me, I can't speak out against the coal companies. We would have nothing here without them. And lastly, the hillbilly stereotype has meant that coal is all they have been told they can be proud of. So of course they're going to defend this industry as a matter of pride. So I'm going to stop there because I know my time is up. But on my last slide, I wanted to put a list of environmental justice organizations fighting fossil fuel industries in case folks are interested in supporting some of these groups. And so the last three are ones that are based in Appalachia, and the first two are environmental justice organizations supporting people of color communities and indigenous communities. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell. Hi, everyone. I'm Casey J. Adler, co-creative director of Actors Circle Ensemble. And if you have a question, feel free to throw it into the Q&A section, and I'll ask Dr. Bell whatever you have on your mind. We have about 7 to 10 minutes in regards to our Q&A. So I just wanted to start off in terms of, your book is really interesting. I highly recommend everyone purchasing Fighting King Coal if you're interested in micro-mobilizing local communities and specifically addressing environmental issues around the country. I was wondering what you think could be takeaways, specific starts to other environmental issues across the country where advocates and activists are trying to mobilize local communities.
Yeah. So one thing I actually didn't talk about in this talk because I didn't have time, but one of the sort of key take-homes of the book, I think, is really about how important it is to be careful when you're going into a community to stand in solidarity with local people, to pay attention to the social norms and local culture, because one of the unfortunate things that also has sort of limited mobilization in these communities is that, so as I mentioned, there's a local, a grassroots working class women-driven movement that started at the local level, and at the invitation of local environmental justice groups, folks from outside the region came to stand in solidarity with local people. And that was, on one hand, really great because it meant that mountaintop removal mining wasn't Appalachia's dirty little secret anymore, like it had been for a long time. It sort of raised the profile of this issue to the national level, and there were a lot of documentary films that came out and things like that. But at the same time, because some of the tactics that the folks from outside used with some high-profile protest events and things like that, local folks just didn't see that as aligning with their values. Like some of the things that
you mentioned Daryl Hannah coming to the to the protests, and you discussed the insider versus outsider, and insiders think, if you're coming here to just come for specifically a protest, what are you doing for the rest of your day? So it is a difficult balance to have on there's a nationalization which brings tons of media attention to that specific issue, but yet you also address the detriments to those national individuals.
Yeah, so keep maintaining the local identity of the movement is really important in order to maintain the base of the folks who are being affected, because if that local identity is lost, then the power of environmental justice movements is the authenticity of the local voices. And so if a lot of local folks are not part of that movement, then those movements can lose their power.
I was wondering, you briefly mentioned in your presentation, and you froze a little bit, but can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. Okay, now
great.
You're back.
You discussed the gendered identities and how deep-rooted they are into almost antiquated identities of masculinity is so, it's dangerous and it's hard, and they're the ones who should be working in the coal fields. Women should be at home. I was wondering, in regards to certain terms today, like toxic masculinity, which is obviously true, but do you think certain terms like that are detrimental in gaining localized action from those male coal miners?
So I think I think the point you bring up is an important one, that language matters, and that, yeah. So I mean, what's going on with the local population is that for many years, and still to this day, masculinity in many of these communities is defined by being a coal miner, and the fact that there are very few coal mining jobs left, and also the fact that women have, for gosh, the past 30 years have had to go into the workforce, and maybe the primary breadwinners in their families now, has meant that that masculinity is under threat. But it's also been that the coal industry has really manipulated that in many ways, by appropriating the local masculinity as being, if you are a friend of coal, if you are supportive of the coal industry, then you are still masculine, you're still valued, even if you're not working for the industry. So I think that that it's very complicated, because masculinity has been tied up in being able to work in the coal mines, and there are so few jobs left in the mines that that it makes a very complicated relationship.
Gotcha. We have a question from Anita. Do you find it to be the norm that people who are victimized by environmental hazards also depend on the industries that perpetuate those hazards?
So that is a pattern. Certainly in many polluting industries target low income, people of color communities, because they have limited political and economic power to fight back. And so one term for that is job blackmail. So essentially, you are promised a job in exchange for taking pollution. And there are a lot of states and a lot of communities that are really hurting for jobs, and so they will welcome those industries, or some people will welcome them. So yeah, I mean, that's certainly a pattern, and one that industry really uses effectively.
We have a question from Bom AB. Who is to blame for the stereotype? And you briefly discussed that. Could you discuss a little bit more on stereotypes? And
Yeah.
he or she goes further. Is there no truth that low-educated miners cannot discern their own best interest?
So the hillbilly stereotype was something that was created in the early 1900s by outside entrepreneurs, scholars, and travel writers, and one purpose of the stereotype was land theft. I mentioned in the talk. I mean, this is the second wave of land theft, right? Of course, the land was stolen from indigenous people first, but the white settlers that were there at the turn of the 1900s, they didn't know. Most of them did not know the value of the minerals beneath their land, and so folks from New York, from outside, came in and essentially, some of them outright stole the land, some of them tricked people out of their land. And part of the ability to justify that land theft was by making these people out to be less than human, in very similar ways that white settlers did to indigenous people. And so it was an intentional thing, and has continued throughout the past 100 years. It's not a stereotype that went away. I mean, similar things happen. I'm in Southwest Virginia, which the part of Southwest Virginia I'm in is not a coal mining area, but the mountains around me, poor white folks were taken out of the mountains, and as part of the eugenics movement, and were shipped down to Lynchburg, and were put in institutions and sterilized. I mean, so there's a really ugly history with a lot of this, but the hillbilly stereotype is something that was constructed and used by people in order to exploit and take the resources in the land. I mean, people from Shenandoah National Park, they were also removed from the park in order to make the park, you know, so there's a long history of this in the United States.
We have a question from Jennifer. How can people protect themselves from the coal oil industry when trying to free themselves of it, since this industry has so much power and are known to be bullies? And I would kind of just latch on to that. Other industries who have great power in their specific local communities.
Organize. That's, I mean, that's where the power is. And there are really a lot of environmental justice groups, grassroots groups, trying to do this work of getting people together and organizing to fight back. And so in Appalachia, there are groups that have made some, you know, it's difficult because the coal industry has so much power, but they've filed lawsuits, and there's been individual, you know, small scale successes in some communities to hold the coal industry accountable. And so, I mean, that's the biggest thing. We need to organize, and it's not just about sending donations to the big green organizations. It's supporting the grassroots organizations that are doing the work on the ground.
Cool. We'll end on this question. Maybe give some some positivity to the end of this. What does a positive future look like for Appalachia? And this is from Bridget. Did you hear that?
Sorry, no, my internet connection is unstable. Did you?
Oh, that's
sorry.
Okay.
Can you ask the question
Last question. We'll end on a positive note from Bridget. What does a positive future look like for Appalachia?
That's a great question. So a positive future for Appalachia, I would say local economies, land justice, getting the land back in the hands of the people who live there, and you know, and a future decentralized, you know, small scale renewable energy projects where communities are empowered to have control over their energy future. I think that, and that's not just Appalachia, I think that's something that needs to happen throughout the country, taking power away from the big corporations and decentralizing it, putting it in the hands of local people and growing local solutions, not ones that are top down.
Thank you so much for joining us for that wonderful presentation. You can find her book everywhere. It's published by MIT Press, Fighting King Coal, if you're interested in micromobilization of local communities. And thank you very much for joining us for this event. And next week we'll have youth empowerment and education.
All right. Thank you for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you.